Thank you very much for your contribution. Well, I think that now it's time to pass through the presentation of Susan Fuller. Susan, are you okay?
Hey, Elmo.
Good morning.
Yes. Good morning. Good evening, Elmo.
Good evening for you. Okay.
Yes, that's it. Yes, we'll have a wine break when you have your coffee break, I fear. Thank you so much for your wonderful organisation. Thank you to the local organising committee. You've done a fantastic job. I wish I was there. I wish I could be sipping Prosecco and eating pasta with you, but alas, instead, we are online. Hang on a second. I will just start that again and share my sound. Okay. So for something a little bit different, I'm not sure why that's doing that. Can you see, Elmo, is that full screen or is that not full screen?
Yeah. Not
okay.
No, it's not full screen. There are two other.
Hang on.
I think that.
How's that?
His next slide, yes, it's not full screen. No? You have to swap. Okay. Oh, okay.
Got to start again. What am I doing? Try that again.
No worry, no worry. Okay, and full screen. No.
No, I have no idea why it's doing that.
No. No. Okay.
Technology is not with me.
It worked when you said hide presenter view. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ines. There we go. Now we're ready to go. Thanks for being patient, everybody. You'd think after teaching online for the last year, I'd actually have some clue what I'm doing. But anyway, I'm going to speak about something very different today to what everyone else has been talking about. And this talk has largely been inspired by my irritation with vegetation management in Australia. We all recognise the big issues we have with habitat loss and fragmentation worldwide, but possibly you didn't realise that in Australia that we've managed to clear more than 50% of our native vegetation since European settlement 200 years ago. And in particular, the lovely state where I live and work, we've had a terrible rate of land clearing, vegetation clearing, being responsible for about 60% of Australia's land clearing. One particular bioregion in Australia has been heavily impacted, and that's this area in the semi-arid zone of Australia, in which we've had about 108,000 hectares of vegetation cleared in 1 year alone, which was more than clearing rates in that year in places like Brazil. So it is a rather dramatic issue in this country. And as I said at the beginning, this project largely came from my frustration with changing governments, changing vegetation protection laws, and the failure to recognise the importance of what we call in this country regrowth vegetation. So regrowth vegetation is vegetation that's native but not what we would consider remnant. So it's been cleared or it's been thinned and therefore isn't considered to be in its natural remnant state. So this regrowth vegetation has been largely abused in Australia, well, in the state of Queensland anyway. So I'm going to take you through, take you all about 10 hours drive west of Brisbane, so about 1,000 kilometres from where we are, where I am right now, to a place called Bowra Wildlife Sanctuary in the semi-arid zone. It is a landscape of quite a responsive landscape relative to weather conditions, current conditions. We've just come out of 8 years of drought where, you know, it was quite devastating for the wildlife. a lot of the mulga lands bioregion is covered in mulga, which is a vegetation community that is quite an important one. It's an acacia shrubland. So the acacias are really good at nitrogen fixing. So they have these rhizobia on their roots. So they are important for putting nitrogen into the soil. They're a very efficient vegetation for harvesting of water, and they tend to grow, mulga tends to grow in these groves, and these groves are particularly important because they have all the water and the nutrients and therefore important habitat. Unfortunately, however, during drought, mulga is also particularly tasty for cattle. And so during drought, when there's not enough green food on the ground, it's fairly common practice for regrowth acacia vegetation to be bulldozed and cleared to provide fodder for cattle. Cattle can graze on the leaves of the mulga once it's knocked down, which you can see in that top right slide. I'm all not really surprised, I'm sure, to know that Australia is a very big country. So for us, in a lot of areas, particularly when we head into the centre of Australia, we can't really embark on assisted restoration. We can't really embark on a program of tree planting or revegetation or, managed restoration. So largely we rely on what we call unassisted restoration. So that's just natural vegetation returning, regrowing. And as I started the talk, this has been largely neglected under recent changes in vegetation management laws in the state of Queensland, and is allowed to be cleared in many areas. So, as I said, started this journey because of my frustrations with that and wanting to show that there is some biodiversity value of this regrowth vegetation. And through conversations with the ecologists at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, we came up with this project to investigate the species assemblages in regrowth vegetation. So this is work undertaken by a student of mine. So I'll just introduce you to Australian Wildlife Conservancy's property, the Bowra Wildlife Sanctuary. It is a large property that they've taken over more than 15 years, well, not quite sure the date, but quite a long time ago, and removed cattle from the property and have since been managing for conservation. Because it was previously grazed, there are a range of different vegetation ages on the property. So we have some clearing that is younger, we have some that is older, and some areas that haven't been cleared. So you get a feeling for the type of country that we're talking about. It is obviously a wonderful habitat for more than 219 birds have been reported on Bowra. Obviously, some of you are familiar with some of the more iconic ones, like the emu here, the dad and his chicks. In times of wet, which doesn't happen very often, this is a 1 in 10 year event when there is enough rainfall that the holy cross frog emerges from somewhere around 1 metre below the ground and actually makes use of that time when there's rain around, moisture around, to reproduce, and then burrows back down into the sand. A vulnerable list made to Mitchell cockatoo. Lots and lots of parrots and cockatoos out in this landscape. Obviously very, as I mentioned before, very responsive to rainfall events. Brendan Doohan is a lovely young man who did this study, and I like to refer to him as my bird nerd, as amazing skills at identifying birds. So he undertook this project. So this project is about trying to, as I said, understand the value of regrowth vegetation for biodiversity, and we chose to look at birds. We chose to set up an acoustic monitoring study. We had this at 9 sites across 3 age classes of vegetation. So we have mulga that was cleared in the bottom left here less than 15 years ago. So it tends to be very small shrubs. This is mulga that was cleared between 15 to 30 years ago. We've still got some of the taller trees left and the regrowth coming back through. And then we have the vegetation that's never been cleared or not within the known history of the property. And so we have, those are our 3 age classes of vegetation. From all that recording, Brendan went about IDing every single bird species he could find in 20 minutes across, I think it was 15 days, something like that, a massive amount of listening to files and identifying birds. And we looked at species richness. We looked at functional diversity. So this is using basically looking at the different bird species, working out what foraging type of bird they were, certain other morphological characteristics, and assigning them to a functional group, and then looking at the diversity of the groups. And then we also looked at phylogenetic diversity. So compiling all of the genetic information for the different birds that were present and looking at how distinct the bird species were in different age classes of vegetation. And the results of this study are not really surprising, probably at first glance, and that is that diversity favours the old. Okay, this is species richness, and in the old growth treatment, we had higher diversity than we had in the middle class, the middle-aged treatment, and in the very young regrowth, we had less species. Same for the phylogenetic diversity, very consistent pattern. Old had higher phylogenetic diversity, functional diversity, sorry, and same for the phylogenetic diversity. The pattern was consistent. So it's a really great outcome, and it's kind of, I guess, what we expected. Old growth had more diversity. But what was really important, I think, and the real message from this is that the new regrowth still had a lot of birds. This is still a significant number of species, considering the environment that we're talking about. It's a harsh environment. It's a semi-arid environment. You know, the 6 months prior to this study being undertaken, they had 12 millimetres of rainfall. So rainfall out there is measured in, you know, tens of millimetres if you're lucky. That having that number of birds in that environment, I think, is something that we should be very much advocating to the managers of vegetation in this country. It's still significant and needs to be protected. But moving on from there, what else can we learn from this? We know that we need special students to come along to do all this laborious manual listening and tagging of bird species. And so the lure of acoustic indices is great. So what we did was compared our tagged audio, the number of species per minute, with 18 acoustic indices generated using the QUT analysis programs software. And then we used some GLMMs to look at species richness and across sites with date and time as random factors. So what we found with this is that the top 3 performing indices were high frequency cover, mid frequency cover, and ACI. And that there is a trend here that old has higher index values than intermediate and new. But you know, the results of the GLMMs show that we have very poor marginal R-squared variation, R-squared values, indicating that species richness is not really explaining all that much of the variation, and that random effects are more important. And I mean, this doesn't trouble me too much, because I think acoustic indices can tell us a lot of different information. And I think where I want to take this story now is to have a think about what other factors are important here. It's just not how many species we have, but what else is determining the biodiversity in these different age classes. And I would, I guess, say that a picture, you know, tells 1,000 words. here are the false color spectrograms. So if you're familiar with these false color spectrograms, basically the spectrogram for the recording is colored according to the acoustic index value. This is the old site just for one particular day that we look at, and you can see that the pink is ACI, entropy is green, events per seconds is the blue colorings, and the shades are determined by the amount or the value of the index. What we can see here is it's obvious. The old has a lot more activity than the intermediate or the new regrowth. So there is a very clear visual pattern here that tells us a lot straight up that we can see. That it's not just about the number of species, but how active these species are. And in particular, when we start to look at the species, we can see that certain species are more dominant in the old relative to the intermediate and the new. Generally, we have this pattern that the old has a lot more of these active species, these high calling species. So this is the relative activity of each of these species. And these are particularly noisy birds. So I'm just going to play you a little bit of the dawn chorus at the old mulga site. So it's pretty evident from that little short snapshot, and then the indices are very accurately reflecting that. When we have these really strong bursts of activity of different species, we're getting very high index values. So these prolific callers, is what we'll call them, are generally those species that are highly nomadic and come into this area in response to the conditions at the time. So they'll come in from another area where maybe something's not flowering, where maybe hasn't been rainfall, and come into areas after falling rainfall. So phenology becomes really an important thing here. So I think hark back to Jerome and point out the importance of looking at trends over time. So what we set out to do then was to set recorders out for the next 3 years in these areas. I just wanted to show you, before I show you that, the results of that. This is the same vegetation, the same shrub here that we can see on the bottom right. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the same shrub that you can see here on the bottom right near our song meter. This is it after 12 millimeters of rain, essentially. Okay, flowering and attracting a whole range of different parrots into this vegetation. So the local weather conditions become incredibly important here, and then the response of the vegetation to the rainfall. And this is a really rapid response from the vegetation. So we put out sensors at some of the sites for another few years to have a look at the changes, and again what we can see is you've got your old lots of activity here. In 2018 there was it was another year of drought. We'd had a little burst of rainfall in 2017 that gave us a flush of green, but there was prolonged dry conditions in 2018, and then in 2019 we had another good amount of rainfall, and you can see that the activity strongly increases again. So I think what's really important, and if you remember back to that very first slide of the new regrowth site, you can see how the vegetation has responded to that just on the ground covers alone. So the bird species that are coming into these areas are those that will be foraging on those ground covers, and as the vegetation community ages and we get areas for perching and the predatory birds can come in, the gleaning birds come in and hunt in the canopies. So we get a very strong change in the community composition in these areas in response to the changing age of the vegetation, but also the phenology. I think where we want to take this now is to start thinking about how we can map some of the environmental data. One of the particular data sets we've been looking a little bit at is an index that's similar to, if you've worked with remote sensing data, you're probably familiar with the normalized difference in vegetation index. This is similar to that. It's the soil adjusted vegetation index. It's particularly useful for semi-arid environments where you get a lot of reflectance off of that bare soil, that red soil, and it adjusts for that. And again, when you look across the age classes, we can see that, you know, we have a higher vegetation index in the older age classes. So we've got some analysis to do here, but essentially what we want to do is start to look at these environmental indices and see if we can relate them back to the acoustic information that we gather. So the future, I'll keep this quite short, the future really for us is to think about the ecological causes for the changes in the indices we're seeing, the shifts in the community composition, thinking about how insect activity and phenology will influence the vocalizations, the communities that are coming into these areas, factoring into this the environmental conditions that are present just at the time when you're sampling is critical. And I think really importantly is trying to combine things like changes in activity, relative to geographic factors, climatic factors, vegetation features, doing some really important modelling work here to try and understand how soundscapes vary in response to these attributes. And I would encourage you to listen to Marina Scarpelli's talk tomorrow, where she's going to show some more Bowra data from the Bowra Wildlife Sanctuary, where she's looking at how soundscapes vary over very fine spatial scales, 200 metres apart, sensors 200 metres apart. So really interesting to take this, research further by looking at those sorts of important attributes that will be influencing our soundscapes. So to finish with this, I think it's, for me, it's been really satisfying to be able to show that this regrowth vegetation is very important, has conservation value. Hopefully that can lead to some change in how we approach managing our vegetation communities, and a lot more research to be done. You know, we're really underappreciated but really important landscape in the semi-arid zone. I'll finish with the final slide to acknowledge QT for funding. Australian Wildlife Conservancy have been great in allowing us to undertake the projects out there and supporting the work, and to thank or acknowledge Stuart, who introduced me to the world of acoustics in 2010. So on that, I'll happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Susan. I appreciate your presentation. And what happened? Well, I think that there are questions from Lynn Schatzkopf, and can you read directly, Susan?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Elmo. Thank you, Lynn. Were the species in the new a different set of species than the old? So there was a slight difference in species composition. We actually did do the NMDS and looked at the actual presence, absence of species, and definitely the new was had different species. There were obviously some common across the new, the intermediate and the old, but there were largely, and you can look in the paper if you want more information, but largely we see a transition of different species going from those that can occupy or work or forage in shrubby vegetation on the ground and in that shrub of the new, but we certainly didn't see any of those perching birds or those birds that glean insects from canopies and those sorts of things. So there was definitely, we had a clear relationship with vegetation structural development. So it's really important that we, you know, as the vegetation ages and the structural changes, we see a change in the vegetation, a change in the bird species community. So another question.
Yes. Gabriel,
Yeah.
Carl.
Is fire an important factor in the environment? Not so much out there. There's not that many, there are not that many people around. These large properties are generally owned by large pastoral companies. So there's not so much Indigenous land management out there in this particular area where we're working. AWC manage a lot of their properties with fire. I'm not exactly sure of the fire management for Barra, but it's certainly within the 3 years of this study, certainly there was no fire out there. But drought definitely is the big one. Climate and cutting, yeah, definitely all those are a factor, but no fire during the study itself where we were working. And generally speaking, I don't think it's a large impact on that ecosystem in that area. I think that the mosaic among old intermediate is important. I think it is very important. The mosaic, if by that you mean...
Susan, excuse me, can you read the question? Because
sorry, the audience can't see them. Hey, Susan, and adding to the question above, to what extent do you think that the mosaic among old, intermediate and young is important for birds? It is probably extremely important, and it is certainly something we need to analyse, looking at you know, the size of the patches that are left, how connected they are. Generally, the regrowth is in a large area of, you know, all of the same age clearing, but then it does grade into other areas which might not have been cleared as recently. The issue we did have with this study is that the old mulga, the one that hadn't been cleared, is fairly isolated from all the other study sites. So it is potential that we were getting species coming into that from outside of that. So the landscape mosaic is always important. Elmo's written books about landscape structure and landscape mosaics. It is critical to the ecology, and certainly would be relevant in this case too. But certainly not something we've gotten on to analysing just yet.
Okay, thank you, Susan, for your presentation.
No worries, Elmo. Thank you so much for having me.
And now we have a 15 minutes